There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple fact of a power outage. You don't recognize them as thresholds at the time. There is no celestial choir, no sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. There is only the moment itself, and the choice you make within it, a choice that will later seem to have been the only one possible, a hinge upon which the rest of your story would swing. For me, that moment arrived in the dark, smelling of rain-soaked earth and the laundry detergent Liam always used, the one that claimed to smell like a mountain sunrise. It arrived with the soft sound of his socked feet on the worn linoleum of our dorm room, and a question whispered so quietly it was nearly stolen by the sound of the wind rattling our window pane. He was standing by my bed, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the window, the distant campus security lights casting just enough glow to etch the outline of his shoulders. The power had been out for an hour, a sudden, campus-wide blackout that had plunged our building into an unfamiliar and profound silence. The usual cacophony of competing stereos, late-night video games, and shouting down the hall had been snuffed out, leaving only the weather and the sound of our own breathing. I had been reading by the light of my phone, the battery ticking down like a doomsday clock, when he finally spoke. "Hey," he'd said. His voice was different in the dark, stripped of the usual boisterous energy that clung to him like the scent of chlorine after practice. It was something smaller, more vulnerable. "Hey," I'd answered, my own voice a low murmur. I didn't look up from the glowing screen, feigning an absorption I didn't feel. Every nerve ending I possessed was aware of him standing there, of the space he was occupying, of the subtle shift in the room's equilibrium. "My side's freezing," he said. It was a statement of fact. His desk and bed were pressed against the exterior wall, the one with the drafty, ill-fitting window that was a losing warrior in a constant battle against the New England autumn. My side of the room, by some miracle of architectural fluke, was always a few degrees warmer, nestled against an interior wall that shared warmth with the room next door. I waited. I knew this was not the real reason he was standing there. The silence stretched, filled with the things we had never learned how to say to each other in the 2.5 years we had shared this 10 by 12 foot box. It was a silence dense with the architecture of our friendship, a structure we had built with such care, full of load-bearing walls and carefully placed boundaries I was terrified to test. Then came the question, "Can I?" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, as tangible as the scent of ozone from the storm outside. It was a request for warmth, for shelter, for something more than a blanket. It was a request for proximity, and I understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that to say yes was to open a door I had kept bolted for a very, very long time. My phone screen flickered, a low battery warning. The room was about to be plunged into total darkness. And in that final, fleeting moment of artificial light, I looked at him, truly looked at his shape in the gloom, and I shifted, pulling back the edge of my comforter. It was not a word, but it was an answer. It was the beginning of everything. We had been a product of the university's housing algorithm, a random pairing of two opposite poles. Liam was motion, I was stillness. He was a swimmer, a creature of the water, all kinetic energy and broad-shouldered confidence. His life was measured in split seconds and the roar of the crowd, a world of clean lines and clear objectives. His laughter was a loud, uninhibited thing that could fill our small room and spill out into the hallway, gathering others in its wake. People orbited Liam. He was a sun, radiating an effortless warmth that made you want to lean in closer. He moved through the world with an uncomplicated grace, seemingly untroubled by the kind of deep, analytical currents that so often pulled me under. I was a photographer. My world was framed, captured, and held at a distance. I lived in the quiet spaces, in the nuances of light and shadow. While Liam was carving his way through the water, I was in the darkroom, watching images emerge from nothing in the chemical bath, a slow and patient magic. I was the observer, the one on the periphery, cataloging the world through a viewfinder. My natural state was one of remove, a self-imposed exile from the messy, unpredictable flow of things. I preferred the stillness of a captured moment to the chaos of the moment itself. I had always found it safer to love the world from behind a lens. Our first year together was a study in negotiated territory. His perpetually damp towels versus my carefully organized contact sheets. His 5 a.m. alarm for morning practice versus my late nights spent editing. The glow of my monitor the only light in the room. We were two different species forced to share a habitat, and for a while, we simply coexisted, moving around each other in a polite, if slightly awkward, dance. We learned the rhythms of the other's life without ever truly entering it. I knew that the smell of chlorine meant he'd had a hard practice. He knew that the sharp, vinegary scent of Stop Bath meant I was on a deadline. The friendship, when it finally bloomed, did so in the mundane soil of shared space. It happened in small, almost imperceptible increments. It was him leaving a slice of pizza on my desk after a late night with his teammates, knowing I'd forget to eat. It was me quietly replacing his perpetually empty bottle of shampoo without comment. It was the night he came back, defeated and exhausted after missing a qualifying time by a fraction of a second, and instead of going out with the team, he just collapsed on his bed and stared at the ceiling. I didn't say anything. I just put on a quiet album I liked, a wordless offering of solace, and we sat there in the shared silence until he fell asleep. That was the first time I felt the shift, the transition from roommate to something more. We had become each other's constant, the fixed point in the chaotic orbit of college life. For me, however, another line was crossed, a line he was entirely unaware of. I can pinpoint the exact moment. It was sophomore year, at one of the big home meets. I'd gone, mostly out of a sense of obligation, armed with my camera to feel less like a spectator and more like a participant. I was watching him through my telephoto lens, trying to capture the explosive power of his start off the block. And then, after his race, he was standing by the side of the pool, water streaming from his hair, laughing with his coach. The harsh natatorium lights caught the droplets on his shoulders, turning them into a constellation of tiny, glittering stars. And in the focused, magnified world of my lens, I saw the curve of his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, and I felt something in my chest constrict. It wasn't friendship. It was a sharp, breathtaking pang of something else, something I recognized with the sickening certainty of a diver hitting cold water. It was a feeling I immediately knew I had to bury. Liam was my friend. He was my best friend. And he had a girlfriend, Sarah, a kind, intelligent girl from his economics class. They were a perfect, golden couple, and my feelings were a foreign, invasive species in that ecosystem. So I did what I knew how to do best. I retreated behind the lens. I filed the feeling away, locking it in a light-tight box in the darkroom of my own mind, a place where it couldn't be exposed, couldn't be developed, couldn't risk ruining the one stable, good thing I had. I became an expert in the art of loving him silently, of appreciating the warmth of the sun without ever letting myself get burned. Our friendship was a delicate, beautiful thing, a perfectly balanced composition, and I would not be the one to knock it out of focus. I told myself that the quiet ache was a small price to pay for his presence in my life. For a long time, that was enough. The tectonic plates of our little world began to shift in the autumn of our junior year. It started with Sarah. Theirs wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup, but a slow, quiet erosion. A continental drift. They had been together since the end of freshman year, a fixture in the social landscape of our lives. But college is a relentless force of change, and it had begun to pull them in different directions. She was accepted into a competitive study abroad program in London for the spring semester. He was doubling down on his training, his sights set on the nationals. Their future was beginning to look like two diverging paths, and they were both smart enough and kind enough to each other to admit it. The breakup, when it came, was amicable, mature, and utterly devastating for Liam. He wasn't a person who was built for being alone. His entire life had been structured around teams, partnerships, relationships. He was a creature of connection, and Sarah's absence created a vacuum, a sudden, unnerving silence in the soundtrack of his life. He had lost his primary confidant, his social co-pilot, his other half. He was untethered, and he began to drift. His behavior changed in subtle ways at first. He spent more time in our room. The door closed more often than it was open. The booming laugh that used to echo down the hall became a rarer currency. He'd skip the post-practice dinners with his teammates, claiming he was tired, and would instead just appear in the room, dropping his gear bag with a heavy sigh and collapsing onto his bed. He started talking less and watching more. He'd sit on the edge of his mattress, elbows on his knees, and just watch me work as I edited photos on my laptop. He wouldn't speak for an hour at a time, his presence a quiet, heavy weight in the room. I understood what was happening. He was lonely. It was a profound, disorienting loneliness that he didn't know how to articulate. He wasn't looking for advice or distraction, the things his teammates offered him in spades. He was seeking something quieter. He was seeking a presence. He needed an anchor in the storm of his own quiet grief, and for reasons I couldn't fully fathom, he had chosen me. My role in his life began to subtly transform. I was no longer just the quiet observer in the background. I had been pulled into the foreground of his emotional landscape. It was a dangerous time for me. Every quiet evening we spent in shared silence was a test of my resolve. The feelings I had so carefully locked away began to rattle the door. A terrible, selfish part of me felt a flicker of hope in his sadness, a hope I immediately smothered with guilt. I was his friend, and his heart was broken. My own complicated feelings had no place here. My job was to be a steady, uncomplicated harbor. So I learned to sit with his silence, to offer comfort without words. I'd make him a cup of tea. I'd put on a movie we both liked. I created a space for his sadness to exist without judgment. I was determined to be the friend he needed, even if it felt like holding my breath underwater. I was so focused on maintaining the boundary between us that I didn't notice he was the one who was beginning to erase it. The power outage was the event that turned the unspoken into the explicit, the catalyst that gave his amorphous need a physical form. His whispered question in the dark was not just about the cold. It was the culmination of weeks of him drifting closer, of him seeking a kind of solace I was uniquely positioned to provide. When his weight settled onto the mattress beside me, the sound of the springs groaning in protest, it felt both shocking and inevitable. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, a fragile and terrifying intimacy. He lay on his back, a rigid line of muscle and bone, careful not to touch me. I did the same, my body a mirror of his, every muscle tensed. We were two continents of warmth separated by a tiny, charged ocean of bedsheets. "Thanks," he mumbled into the darkness. "It's fine," I whispered back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity, listening to the wind and the frantic beat of my own pulse. I was hyper-aware of everything. The subtle scent of his skin, the almost imperceptible sound of his breathing, the sheer volume of heat radiating from his body. It was a sensory overload that threatened to short-circuit my carefully constructed defenses. I was lying next to the one person in the world who could undo me, and he had no idea. The darkness was both a blessing and a curse, providing a cloak of anonymity while simultaneously heightening every other sense. I felt as though my skin was buzzing, a high-frequency hum of yearning and fear. Slowly, as the minutes bled into an hour, the rigid tension began to dissolve. Sleep, or the promise of it, began to soften his posture. I felt, rather than saw, him turn onto his side, facing away from me. The movement was small, but it shifted the entire dynamic of the space between us. A little while later, another, smaller shift. His arm, in what I told myself was the unconscious seeking of comfort in sleep, flopped backward, his hand coming to rest on the mattress near my hip. It wasn't touching me, not yet, but it was a breach of the perimeter. My breath hitched. I lay perfectly still, a statue carved from anxiety, praying he was asleep, praying he wasn't. This became the blueprint for the ritual. That first night set the precedent. The power came back on sometime around 3 a.m., flooding the room with the sudden, harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent light. We both flinched, blinking like creatures of the deep suddenly dragged into the sun. He mumbled something incoherent, pulled himself from my bed without a word, and stumbled back to his own, leaving behind a lingering pocket of warmth on the sheets. In the morning, it was as if it had never happened. We went about our routine, his alarm, his shower, my groaning into my pillow, with no mention of the shared space, of the hours spent lying inches apart in the dark. He had created the perfect escape route, plausible deniability. It was just the power outage. It was just the cold. It meant nothing. But it did happen again. A week later, he came in late from a party. I was already in bed, reading. He didn't turn on the main light, just his desk lamp, and moved around the room with a practiced quietness. I pretended to be asleep. I heard him get into his own bed, the familiar creak of his mattress. I thought that was it. But then, a few minutes later, I heard the sound again, closer this time. "You awake?" he whispered. I took a breath. "Yeah, had a nightmare," he said. The lie was so thin it was transparent, but it was the required toll for crossing the bridge. It was the story we agreed to tell ourselves. I didn't say anything. I just moved over. This time, it was different. He was less hesitant. He slid under the covers and turned onto his side, his back to me, but much closer than before. Close enough that I could feel the heat seeping through his t-shirt. Close enough that if I had just reached out my hand, my fingers would have brushed against the knobs of his spine. I lay there, rigid again, my mind a chaotic swirl of questions. What were we doing? What did this mean? Was I just a comfort object, a human-shaped teddy bear he used to ward off the ghosts of his breakup? Or was this something more? The ambiguity was excruciating. It was a kind of emotional Schrodinger's cat. As long as we never spoke of it, the reality of the situation could be both platonic and not, simultaneously. To open the box, to ask the question, would be to force a conclusion, and I was terrified of what that conclusion might be. The ritual evolved, slowly, organically, with the silent, creeping pace of a vine growing up a wall. The pretexts became flimsier, sometimes non-existent. Sometimes it was a nightmare, sometimes it was the cold, but often, it was just a quiet, questioning look from his side of the room and my silent acquiescence. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. One night, he fell asleep with his arm thrown across my waist. I lay awake for hours, feeling the gentle pressure of his hand on my hip, my entire body a live wire. I studied the way his chest rose and fell, the soft puff of his breath against my neck. It was a form of exquisite torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, and yet the emotional gulf felt wider than ever. I was a secret keeper in my own bed. My photography became my only outlet. I started a new project, a series of self-portraits taken in our room. In the images, I was always out of focus, a blurred figure in the background, while some object of his was in sharp relief in the foreground. His swim parka slung over a chair, a worn-out textbook on his desk, the scuffed pair of sneakers he always left by the door. I was trying to capture the feeling of being a ghost in my own life, of being present but unseen, of my own story being secondary to his. The darkroom became my confessional. I would stand in the eerie red light, watching my own hazy image appear on the paper, and I would let myself feel the full weight of the yearning I had to suppress every night. I was developing a photograph of my own heartbreak, and the image was becoming clearer every day. The nights were a landscape of breathtaking intimacy, the days a desert of polite distance. In the morning, the spell was always broken. We'd revert to our established roles, the jock and the artsy roommate. We'd talk about classes, about practice, about the weather. We never, ever talked about the fact that we had spent the night tangled together, sharing breath and body heat. The silence on the subject was a wall we were both actively fortifying. For him, I suspected, it was a way to avoid confronting what he was doing, to keep it compartmentalized in a space that didn't require analysis or labels. For me, the silence was a form of self-preservation. I was so terrified of losing the friendship that I was willing to accept these stolen moments of closeness, even if they were built on a foundation of unspoken things. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, choosing to believe in the fiction he was creating because the reality was too painful to contemplate. that I was probably just a temporary fix, a convenient port in a storm, and that one day, the storm would pass, and he would sail away, leaving me stranded. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday. It had been a long week of midterms, and the entire campus was frayed and sleep-deprived. Liam had a major economics exam the next morning that he was completely unprepared for. He'd been trying to study all evening, but he was restless, pacing the small confines of our room like a caged animal. He'd read the same page of his textbook 5 times, his frustration mounting with each pass. Finally, he slammed the book shut with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire semester. "It's no use," he said, running a hand through his already messy hair. "My brain is just static. You need to sleep," I said from my bed, where I was trying to read for my art history seminar. He just looked at me. The look was different this time. It wasn't just tired or lonely. It was raw. It was a look of profound, unvarnished need. He didn't even bother with an excuse. He just walked over, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled back the corner of my comforter. He slid into the bed, and the mattress dipped under his weight in that now familiar way. But instead of turning his back to me, he stayed on his side, facing me. The only light in the room was my small bedside lamp, casting a soft, warm glow that turned the space into a small, intimate cave. We were inches apart, close enough for me to see the faint smattering of freckles across his nose, to see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. The air between us was electric, humming with all the words we had never said. The ritual had always been conducted under the cover of darkness, in the ambiguous territory of presumed sleep. This was different. This was conscious. This was intentional. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I could feel the heat rolling off his skin. He didn't say anything, just held my gaze. His eyes, usually so bright and clear, were cloudy with something I couldn't name. It looked like a mixture of confusion, fear, and a desperate kind of longing. It was the same look I imagined I had in my eyes every time I looked at him. In that moment, I felt as though I was looking into a mirror. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a rubber band. I watched a dozen different emotions flicker across his face. He was having a war with himself, and I was the battlefield. I could feel the tremor in the muscle of his jaw as he clenched his teeth. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, to let him off the hook, but I was paralyzed. I was terrified that any word I spoke would be the wrong one, the one that would shatter this fragile, impossible moment. He finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper, a rough, frayed thing. "Hey," he said. I could only manage a nod. "Can I ask you something stupid?" My throat was tight. I nodded again. He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping from my eyes to my mouth. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. It was a declaration. The air crackled. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches of space between our faces. He looked back up, his eyes searching mine, asking for something I wasn't sure I was allowed to give. "Would it be okay?" he started, his voice cracking on the last word. "If I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He left it hanging in the air, a question mark made of hope and terror. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the threshold. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. I could pretend not to understand. I could make a joke, deflect, and preserve the safe and painful status quo of our friendship. I could keep the door to that secret room inside me locked forever. Or I could take the key he was offering me and turn it. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake next to him, aching with a love I was too afraid to name. I thought of the lonely hours in the darkroom, watching his world from a distance. I thought of the crushing weight of my own silence. And I realized I was more afraid of that silence than I was of the consequences of breaking it. I was tired of being a ghost. I didn't give him a verbal answer. Instead, I moved. I closed the small, monumental distance between us. My hand came up to cup his cheek, his skin warm and slightly rough with stubble. His eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was all the permission I needed. And then I kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound, earth-shattering gentleness. It was hesitant, soft, a question answered with another question. It was the taste of coffee and anxiety and something that felt impossibly like coming home. His lips were softer than I had imagined. For a moment, he was perfectly still, as if in shock, and my blood ran cold with the fear that I had made a catastrophic mistake. But then, he sighed, a sound that was part surrender, part relief, and he kissed me back. His hand came up to my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, and he pulled me closer. It was no longer just my kiss, it was ours. It was a conversation we were finally having after years of silence. It was a confession, a validation, and a terrifying, beautiful beginning. In the quiet glow of my bedside lamp, in the heart of our shared room, the world I had known was completely and irrevocably rearranged. The aftermath was a silence of a different kind. It was not the comfortable, lived-in silence of our friendship, nor the charged, anticipatory silence of the nights in my bed. It was a brittle, anxious silence, thin as ice over deep water. When the kiss ended, we just looked at each other, our breathing heavy in the quiet room. Liam's face was a mask of shock and bewilderment, as if he'd just woken up from a dream and wasn't sure where he was. He pulled away slowly, disentangling his hand from my hair, and rolled onto his back to stare at the ceiling. He didn't speak. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I had forced the issue. I had read the signs wrong. I had taken his moment of vulnerability and confusion and twisted it into something it wasn't. The warmth of the kiss evaporated, replaced by a chilling dread. "Liam," I whispered. He didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was flat, distant. "I have to study." He slid out of the bed, the movement abrupt and clumsy. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and opened his economics textbook. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the page, though I knew he wasn't reading. A wall had gone up between us, instantaneous and impenetrable. I lay in my bed, the sheets suddenly cold, and watched the rigid line of his back. The intimacy of the last few minutes felt like a hallucination. I turned off my lamp, plunging the room into darkness, as if hiding from what I'd done. We stayed like that for hours, him at his desk and me in my bed, two strangers in a room that had, until tonight, felt like a home. The morning was worse. When my alarm went off, he was already gone. His bed was made with an uncharacteristic, military precision. A note was on my desk. "Went to the library to study. Good luck on your midterm." There was no mention of the night before. It was a clean, surgical excision of the event from our shared history. And so began the great withdrawal. For the next week, Liam was a ghost. He was there, and he was not. He timed his entrances and exits to avoid me, coming back to the room only when he was sure I'd be in class or asleep. He left for practice before I was awake and returned late at night, moving in the dark. The few times we did overlap, the air was thick with a suffocating awkwardness. He would offer clipped, one-word answers to my questions, his eyes fixed on his phone, on his shoes, on anything but me. The easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the comfortable silences, they were all gone, replaced by the strained politeness of two people who wished the other was not there. The pain of it was a physical thing. It was a constant, dull ache in my chest. Every time I walked into our empty room, I felt his absence like a presence. I had risked everything for that one moment of honesty, and it seemed I had lost. I had not just lost the potential for something more. I had lost the friendship that was the very foundation of my life here. The loneliness was staggering. I retreated to my only sanctuary, the darkroom. I spent hours locked in the red-lit silence, printing and reprinting the same images, my hands moving through the chemical trays on autopilot. I was trying to lose myself in the process, but every emerging photograph felt like an accusation. The blurred image of my own form in the corner of the frame seemed to mock me. I had wanted to come into focus, and instead, I had been erased completely. I felt a slow-burning anger begin to curdle beneath the hurt. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for refusing to even acknowledge what had happened between us. He had initiated every step of our journey into this ambiguous territory. He was the one who came to my bed, the one who sought the comfort, the one who asked the question that led to the kiss. And now he was treating me like I had violated him, like I had imagined the whole thing. He had made me feel safe enough to be vulnerable, and then he had punished me for it. The injustice of it gnawed at me. I could live with his rejection, but I could not live in this suffocating, dishonest silence. He didn't get to burn our world down and then pretend he didn't smell the smoke. After a week of this Cold War, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't go on like this. I found him where I knew he'd be after his afternoon practice, sitting on the bleachers overlooking the empty pool. The natatorium was quiet and cavernous, smelling sharply of chlorine and damp concrete. The late afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, distorted reflections on the placid, blue water. He was staring at his own reflection, his shoulders slumped in a way that had become painfully familiar. I walked up the bleachers and sat down a few feet away from him, the clatter of my footsteps echoing in the huge space. He flinched when he heard me, his whole body tensing. He didn't look at me. "Go away, Ethan," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "No," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going anywhere." We sat in silence for a long time. I could hear the rhythmic drip of water from the starting blocks. I watched his reflection in the pool, a shimmering, uncertain version of the person I knew. Finally, I spoke, the words I had been rehearsing in my head for days. "I miss my friend," I said. It was the truest, simplest thing I could say. That was what broke him. A choked sob escaped his throat, a raw, wounded sound that echoed in the empty hall. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. All the anger I had been nursing evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of empathy. I moved closer and put a hand on his back, feeling the tremors that ran through him. "I'm sorry," he choked out from behind his hands. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a coward. Just talk to me, Liam," I pleaded. "Please, don't shut me out." He finally lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, frantic confusion. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "I don't know what's happening. I don't think about guys. I never have. It's always been girls. It's always been Sarah." He took a shuddering breath, looking at me as if I held the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. But then, after she left, everything felt wrong. Empty. And being in the room with you, it was the only time it didn't. It was quiet. It was safe. He looked away, back at the water. "Lying in your bed at night. I told myself it was just because I was lonely, that you were just my friend, and it was just comfort. I kept telling myself that. But it was a lie. I knew it was a lie. Every night, it got harder to pretend." His confession came out in a torrent, a flood of pent-up fear and confusion. "And that night, when I kissed you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a long time. And that terrified me. Because what does that mean? What does that make me? It felt like the whole world shifted under my feet, like everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong." He looked at me then, his expression pleading. "So I ran," he said, his voice cracking. "I ran because I was scared. Not because of you, Ethan. I was scared of me. I was scared of how right it felt. And I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I just pretended it never happened, we could go back to being friends. But that just made it worse. I'm so sorry I hurt you." Hearing the words, hearing the fear and honesty in his voice, was like a release. The knot of anger and hurt inside me finally began to untangle. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been rejecting a part of himself he never knew existed. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that we represented. I understood, because I had spent years doing the same thing, just in a quieter way. I took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, his grip tight, desperate. "You're not a coward," I said softly. "You're just human. And you don't have to have all the answers right now, Liam. We can be confused together." A watery smile touched his lips. Yeah, I said, squeezing his hand. "We can just be, and figure it out. No labels, no pressure. Just us." He nodded, a wave of relief washing over his features. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and we sat there for a long time, watching the light fade over the still, blue water, our hands locked together. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It was not a silence of distance or fear. It was a silence of understanding, a quiet space where we could finally begin to heal. The conversation by the pool was the true beginning. It was not a magical fix. The fear and confusion didn't simply vanish, but it changed the landscape entirely. We had replaced the crumbling, unstable foundation of ambiguity and denial with the bedrock of honesty. We were no longer navigating a minefield of unspoken things. We were two people standing on solid ground, ready to figure out which way to walk next, together. The first few days were tentative, a delicate dance of rediscovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The change was most apparent in the small moments. He started looking me in the eye again. The easy banter returned, a bit rusty at first, but gradually regaining its familiar rhythm. He would come back from practice and tell me about his day, and I would show him the contact sheets from my latest project. We were rebuilding the architecture of our friendship, but this time, we were leaving room for a new door. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. A few nights after our talk, as we were getting ready for bed, he just looked at me from across the room and asked, his voice quiet but steady, "My bed or yours?" The simple, direct question was a revelation. There were no more pretexts, no more lies about nightmares or the cold. It was a choice, offered and accepted. That night, when he slid into my bed, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped an arm around me, pulled me against his chest, and buried his face in my hair. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my back. It was not the frantic, anxious closeness of before. This was calm. This was peace. This was a conscious act of seeking and giving comfort, an acknowledgement of the connection between us. I fell asleep faster and more deeply than I had in months. We began to build a new kind of domesticity, a quiet life shared in the 10 by 12 foot space of our room. We'd study side by side, his knee occasionally pressing against mine. I'd be working at my desk, and I'd feel his hand come to rest on my shoulder, a silent, grounding touch. He started coming to the darkroom with me. He couldn't do much, but he'd sit on a stool in the corner, a quiet presence in the red-lit darkness, watching me work my slow magic. He said he liked the quiet, the patience of it. He said watching me create something beautiful out of nothing helped him understand me better. And I, in turn, learned to appreciate the fierce discipline of his world, the beauty in the clean, powerful lines his body made in the water. We were allowing each other into our separate worlds, and finding that they were not so separate after all. There were still moments of fear, flashes of uncertainty in his eyes. I would see him watching me sometimes with a look of quiet wonder, as if he were still trying to solve the puzzle of himself, of us. But now, when he felt that way, he would talk about it. He would voice his confusion, his worry about what his teammates would think, or what his parents would say. And I would listen. I didn't have the answers for him, but I could offer him the certainty of my own feelings, the unwavering fact of my presence. I became his anchor, and he, in turn, became my harbor. The climax of our story was not that first, hesitant kiss. That was just the prologue. The real story was written in the quiet, mundane moments that followed. It was in the shared cups of coffee in the morning, our hands brushing as we reached for the sugar. It was in the easy way he started leaving his clothes on my side of the room, our territories bleeding into one another until they were indistinguishable. It was in the way we learned to sleep, curled around each other like two halves of a whole, a perfect, unconscious symmetry. It was the slow, patient process of building a home together, not out of bricks and mortar, but out of trust and vulnerability. One afternoon, weeks later, I was printing the final images for my self-portrait series. Liam was there, a quiet shadow in the corner. I pulled the last print from the final wash, a picture I had taken the morning after our talk at the pool. It was another shot of our room, but this time, it was different. In the background, his swim parka was still slung over the chair, but in the foreground, my camera was sitting on my desk, its lens pointing directly at the viewer. And reflected in the lens, tiny but perfectly in focus, were two figures sitting on a bed, their heads close together. It was a picture of him, and it was a picture of me. It was a picture of us. Liam came over to look at it, the print dripping water onto the floor. He stared at it for a long time. "You're in focus," he said softly. I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I guess I am." We learn, eventually, that the most significant developments in our lives don't happen in a flash. They emerge slowly, like an image in a chemical bath, gradually gaining clarity and definition. They require patience and a willingness to stand in the dark, trusting in a process you can't always see or control. Our love story wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow sunrise, the light creeping over the horizon and gently, irrevocably, changing everything. We didn't fall into love. We grew into it, nurturing it in the quiet, shared space between two beds in a small dorm room, until it became a thing strong enough to house us both. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.